Hello, my name is Reva Bhalla, and today I'm joined by Lauren Goodrich, our Eurasia analyst, to discuss the evolution of Kremlinology. So, Lauren, one thing I know about you is that you perversely love to drown yourself in Kremlin politics.
True.
So, given that, and when we talk about Kremlinology as a concept, as a study, what exactly should we know about? What is Kremlinology?
Kremlinology is taking the countless number of pine needles and stepping back and trying to see the forest. So you're taking every little scrap of information inside of Russia, be it photographs of the elites, who attended what meeting within the Kremlin, who stood next to who was speaking with whom, whose wife was lunching with whom, and figuring out the connections and relationships within the Kremlin. And that gives you a picture of three things. First, it shows you what is the ultimate power structure within the Kremlin and the stability of the ultimate leader within the Kremlin, be it the Soviet leader or the current Russian president. Mm-hmm. What is the distribution of assets and wealth within the Kremlin, and who holds and gets to make decisions within those assets and wealth? And third, what's the overall stability of the Russian state itself because of the stability of the Kremlin?
And that's something that can evolve very, very rapidly, as we've seen in history. So if we were looking at old school Cold Warrior politics, what would you see as kind of the most interesting examples of where Kremlinologists were having a field day in picking out those little nuances of who was showing up next to whom, sitting next to whom, and what you were able to glean from that in the power struggle from Khrushchev, after Stalin onwards?
Well, the transition after Stalin is the most obvious, because who could replace Stalin? There were about 8 members within the Kremlin that were in Stalin's inner circle that were the most obvious successors to Stalin. And it took about 5 years of struggles before there was an actual succession that took place. The most obvious person to succeed Stalin was the head of the Communist Party, Malyankov. The problem is that leading into Stalin's death, the years before his death, there was a certain person named Khrushchev who wanted power. He just wasn't the obvious candidate to take power. He was from Ukraine. He was not in Stalin's inner circle.
Sort of the dark horse, kind of like Putin was in many ways.
Very much so. And so Khrushchev started making some very small power plays that to the common person wouldn't look like a power play. But if you're studying the Kremlin as obsessively as we do, then it's a piece of the puzzle. So 2 years before Stalin died, Khrushchev started a series of publications in the Communist Party newspaper, Pravda, against Stalin's wishes. That was unheard of. And it really kind of set him up to be almost a rival to whatever happened after Stalin. And so as soon as Stalin passed, it was obvious that Khrushchev couldn't take power himself. He had to align with one of the power players. He chose the most powerful, which was the head of the NKVD, Beria. And him and Beria sidelined Malyankov in order to make sure that he didn't succeed Stalin.
But Beria himself was not safe in the end.
No, because Khrushchev wanted power for himself. So as soon as they sidelined Malyankov, then Khrushchev ended up siding with Malyankov, and they came up with a plan to get rid of Beria. Now, you can't just get rid of Beria. I mean, he's head of the NKVD. What they needed was the Russian military. Now, the Russian military at the time, or the Soviet military at the time, was actually fighting in Eastern Germany, or suppressing a dissident movement in Eastern Germany. So they had to wait 6 months. And so the hint that we saw as Kremlinologists is to see the Russian or the Soviet military actually come back to Moscow. Why would they come back to Moscow? And then within a few weeks, you had the swift, rapid move of Khrushchev and Malyankov having Beria arrested by the actual Soviet military.
And then, of course, we had Andropov come after that, coming from the KGB side. So multiple security agencies, being a critical instrument of any power struggle within the Kremlin, absolutely essential to watch.
And that's why the power circles within the Kremlin really do focus much more on the security circles instead of the financiers, the economists, the businessmen, the oligarchs. None of them actually have the power compared to the security services.
But they still play a big role and have a loud voice, as we're even seeing today. So moving more into contemporary politics then, we've seen Putin for many years also emerging as a dark horse like Khrushchev did and coming in more easily post-Yeltsin as sort of the savior of Russia. So how would you say he fared for the bulk of his term in office when it came to managing all of those different little struggles?
Putin has been incredibly successful at arbitrating all the various elites within Russia. The way he's done it is he may have come in on the back of the FSB, but he knew he had to have loyalists outside of the FSB, especially within the rivals of the FSB. And so he's had loyalists from the GRU, from the oligarchs, from the business circles, liberal economists even, such as Dmitry Medvedev, have been all loyal to Putin. He created a balance over the past 15 years that was really unheard of.
A very diversified power base at that.
And one that he constantly shifts.
Sure. And he kept everyone on his toes, but anything that Putin wanted usually would happen, right? It wasn't really as big of a question. So when did you see things really start to shift? Because Putin is having a much harder time, I would say, these days in managing each of those power factions. What was the turning point there?
I would say it's two turning points over the past year and a half. The first turning point came when the FSB and Putin were blindsided by events in Ukraine. Russia was taken off guard, and Russia failed to prevent the uprising in Ukraine, the change in government in Kiev, and they were unable to react afterwards in having a grand uprising in Ukraine to reinstate a pro-Russian government. It was a failure, and Putin blamed the FSB. And so right after the events in Ukraine took place, we saw a very dramatic shift in that the portfolio for Ukraine was taken away from the FSB, and it was given to someone who is very loyal, if not a senior member of the GRU, the military intelligence unit, the rival to the FSB. And that was a very big shift. The second big shift is the drop in oil prices. Russia doesn't have the financial assets that it used to have to keep all the elites happy. So the elites are starting to power grab and struggle over money itself. And that's a very hard thing to arbitrate when you're talking about money and power.
Absolutely. And we say Igor Sechin, for example, and Rosneft, what are they asking for $40 billion something now and from the Kremlin, from various loans and everything else. And it's a real question of how exactly is Putin going to manage different factions when you have these big, state champions in a way who are in such dire financial need. But that gives him a little bit of leverage as well, doesn't it?
It's interesting for Sechin because he may be considered a businessman because he's head of Rosneft, but he's also FSB and he's aligned with the FSB. And so having the FSB power wane over the past year and a half due to events in Ukraine, that trickles all the way down into what's the future of Rosneft and the oil production inside of Russia. Everything is interconnected between the elite fights and the overall state of Russia itself.
So how would you roughly outline the sketch of the current power struggle within the Kremlin?
There's a lot of power struggles taking place, but the most important one that we've seen evolve ever since the events in Ukraine is between the FSB and the primary non-FSB rivals, which is a very loosely oriented faction around presidential aide Surkov, who has a lot of influence within the GRU and holds the Ukraine portfolio now, between Chechen President Kadyrov, who is very close, blood brothers pretty much, with Surkov, and a lot of the forces within the Interior Ministry, which the Interior Troops are considered a great rival to the FSB. And so it's those two competing FSB and non-FSB factions at this time.
So Putin is dealing with an economic crisis, an enduring standoff with the West, where the United States is keeping many of its options open, trying to get sanctions lifted, all while trying to manage the power politics within the Kremlin. So certainly he has its hands full. I think it's going to be a growing question of whether he will be able to manage as effectively as we've seen him do earlier in his term. So good thing for our readers is that next week we'll be publishing a 4-part series that you've worked on the evolution of Kremlinology to really put into context both the historical examples that we've seen of Kremlin power politics, the little signs that you watch for, and how that's evolved today. So please check out that 4-part series on our website, stratfor.com, and thank you for joining us today.